There's an ancient Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times." And I would say we are living in interesting times right now. We're living in uncharted territory and uncharted waters. And because of the spread of the coronavirus around our country, and now even in our state, we come to you with some changes that we're making here at Westgate Church of Christ. In times like this, when there's unknown and uncertainty, we go back to certain bedrock principles that are true. I want to direct you to this passage you see up on the board, Matthew 12:30 through 31, where Jesus tells us what's really most important. What is the greatest command? And He tells us that we're to love the Lord our God with everything. Every fiber of our being, we're to love God. And we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. So in the coming days, I want to challenge you as your minister to think about this. Think about loving God with everything you got. Lifting up our fellow men in prayer, people that are struggling with this virus, maybe people that are infected, people that have lost loved ones because of this, people that are experiencing financial hardship because of all of the cancellations and closings, and lift up these people in prayer to the Father. But I want us to think a lot about loving our neighbor, and what is that going to look like? Loving our neighbor means we put their needs ahead of our own. So we need to think deeply about that. In the coming days, as this virus, maybe it spreads, we're just not real sure what's going to happen. We know there's some unknown. But what will loving our neighbor look like as a church family, as people and citizens of the city of Dothan? And because of that idea of loving our neighbor, I've asked Scott to come along and share with us some specifics about the coronavirus and some things you need to know as members of Westgate Church of Christ.
So one of the exhortations we have as Christians is to love the Lord our God with all our mind. And to do that, I think you need to know some basic facts and information. I think this will also help you understand some of the decisions that we've made as a church and help you to more intelligently love your neighbor. So I want to start with talking about the virus just a little bit. It's a new virus. And some people might say, well, does that mean it's been invented, or is somebody behind that? There's some interesting conspiracy theories that are already floating around because of that. And if you want a really boring lecture on cell biology, I'll be glad to give you that sometime and tell you how new viruses occur. But suffice it to say that we're in a situation similar to the Indians when Christopher Columbus came upon the New World, or when the Spanish came to Mexico and met the Mayans and the Aztecs. And as a result, this is a new virus to all of us, and therefore it is very catchy. It's very infectious. It's very easy to spread. There are no vaccines for this particular virus like there are for influenza. And although people get frustrated with the influenza vaccine, even when it's ineffective, it still has some effect. In fact, it's 1 to 2 years before there will be any sort of vaccine for this particular virus. There also are not any medicines that can help with this particular virus. Although there's been many attempts to treat this virus with many, many different agents, no one has met with any significant success anywhere in the world. I want to talk to you a little bit about mortality numbers, and I put an asterisk here because these are all very difficult computational estimates. The number of people with the disease at any given time is hard to determine. The number of people who've had a test may or may not be the same in any different part of the world. And so these numbers have to be taken with a little grain of salt. But I want to call your attention to what the mortality for regular flu is in the United States. It's 0.1% per year, okay? So people who get the flu have a 0.1% chance of dying from it. I want you to compare that to the mortality for coronavirus in South Korea. They did a very good job of getting a hold of that infection and getting out ahead of it. Their mortality rate was 0.6% or something like that, which already is 6 times what the regular flu is. Dr. Fauci from the Institutes of Health thinks that the overall corona-19 virus mortality rate is probably around 1%. And sometimes in certain places, the mortality rate has gotten even higher. So for example, in China, especially in Wuhan, China, the mortality rate was up to 6%. And we'll talk about why that might have been in just a second. Japan is probably doing a very similar job to Korea, and it's somewhere in here. Italy has had some difficulty, and they're edging towards the rates that have been seen in China. Well, let's talk about what happens when you get it. The good news with this virus is that 80% of the people who get it have a very mild disease. They might run a fever. They might have a snotty nose for a little bit. Many of them don't even have symptoms, which presents a problem in and of itself because you can have this and not particularly notice. 14% will get what's called an intermediate form of that flu-like illness or the coronavirus, and it's a lot like having the traditional flu. You feel like you're going to die, but you're not, okay? You're achy, you're feverish, you may or may not have a runny nose, etc. cough, all those kind of things. But you recover eventually, although your wife would swear that you were going to die by the number of complaints that you made. Here's the important number, though. And this is from the European CDC, but it's been validated by other people. 6% of people who get this coronavirus will become critically ill. Now, what does critically ill mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're on a ventilator, but it means they do need to be in a hospital because their diabetes has gotten out of whack, because they're dehydrated and they need IV fluids, because they've developed a pneumonia on top of the coronavirus and they need antibiotics. The University of Nebraska says that rate's about 5%, but both of them are in that same range. 5 to 6% of people will get critically ill who get this illness. So again, the good news is 80% are fine, 14% get pretty sick, but 5 to 6% will become critically ill and need a hospital. Who are these people who get critically ill and need a hospital? Well, mostly, but not all, of these people are older people greater than 70 years of age, or people who have chronic medical conditions, chronic heart disease, chronic lung disease, emphysema, use oxygen, go to dialysis, any kind of chronic medical condition, but these are the most common in the United States. But again, I want to draw your attention that not all. You can be a young person and get a severe form of this and end up very sick. So how many people will get it? Well, there are lots of guesses, and this is based on the way the virus has acted in other places around the world and the way we know viruses spread between people, but using this specific illness in particular. Harvard epidemiologists are saying somewhere between 20 and 60% of our population in the United States will ultimately get this. The University of Nebraska, which has a very excellent infectious disease department, you remember back in the Ebola outbreak, they were some of the key players in that. They're estimating somewhere 29–30% of the population will ultimately get coronavirus. Some experts who testified before Congress last week or two have said somewhere between 21–45%. And the Germans are telling their population to expect up to 65 or 70% of the population to ultimately get coronavirus after it goes all the way through the population. So what does that mean for us? Well, let's talk about that. Let's take a low number. We're going to go with 25%, which is even lower than the University of Nebraska's estimate, and I trust them. Currently, the Dothan Medical Service area includes 750,000 people. That's our referral area, people that are referred into our local hospitals when they get seriously ill. If 25% of this 750,000 people are infected, that means 187,500 people will get coronavirus. If 5% of these people are critically ill, like we talked about over here, that means over 9,000 people will be critically ill, meaning they need to be in a hospital. They need oxygen, they need IV fluids. Some of them will even need a ventilator. If that happened very quickly, like it has happened in China and other places where the infection was not controlled aggressively, so let's say 30 days, that would end up giving us 312 critically ill patients per day rolling into Dothan. Now, there aren't enough ambulances to bring that many people every day, so many of them would be coming in the back of the truck from Geneva and Chipley and wherever, far and wide, coming to the hospital expecting to find care. The problem is, our hospitals cannot handle another 312 critically ill patients per day. This is about the same number of critically ill patients you might find in the medical center as a whole. So imagine a new medical center every day appearing in Dothan. The U.S. has fewer ICU beds than Italy, and you know what's happening there. And these hospitals already have a bunch of sick people in them. Some are there for elective reasons, but many of them are not there. So we're going to have to find a place to put 312 critically ill patients per day. Now you can imagine what would happen when the hospital fills up, which is going to be on the day one, and on day two when we're building tents in the parking lot. And the problem, you say, well, I'm not over 70. I don't have chronic lung disease. But when the hospital is completely full and your child gets appendicitis, there won't be any place for them to go. Or when your dad has a heart attack, or your mom has a stroke, suddenly there is no place, there is no hospital to provide the usual medical care that we've all gotten used to. And I know this is a hard truth to grasp. This is not my first rodeo. I started my microbiology degree over 25 years ago, and I've seen HIV and H1N1 and swine flu and SARS and MERS and all these things come and go. And so I probably, like you, was not terribly excited there at the beginning. And we're so used to medical care going well and being successful in the United States that we can't really fathom what this would look like, to have an extra 300 critically ill people coming into our town every single day wanting and needing medical care. And this is what has happened really in China, where they developed this 6% critical ill population, and they just got behind, and they couldn't take care of all these people, and that's why they lost so many people. So if you're a doubting Thomas and you say, Scott, this is craziness. I've lived here my whole life. I've never seen anything like that. Okay, well, go ahead and divide those numbers I gave you by 10 and say, I don't believe any of that. I don't believe Harvard. I don't believe these University of Nebraska people. I don't believe the CDC. I don't believe the European CDC. I read on Facebook that it's not going to be a big deal. Okay, so we'll divide that number by 10. 31 people every day are going to show up. And an extra 31 people showing up in Dothan every single day, even if it's a tenth of what this number is a big deal. Because about after day 3 and 4, the hospitals will be full. And we'll end up in a very similar, although slower, situation, which is actually what we're after. Because if the hospital is going to function locally, if our medical care is going to function locally, we have to stay below this capacity to provide care for people and hopefully keep them healthy and keep them from getting seriously ill. If you don't do anything, this is what the number of sick people looks like over time. A very short duration, we get a lot of people sick, and I've heard people say, well, this is just the flu, let's get it. Let's all get it and get it over with. And then we can get back to work and we can go open school back up. But you quickly overwhelm the hospital when you do that. So our goal is not necessarily to keep people from getting sick, although if you do what the public health people are asking, you will have fewer infections. But also, those infections will occur over a longer period of time. So we'll have room in the hospital to keep people in the hospital and give them the best care that they possibly need and hopefully keep that mortality rate very low. Some people are saying, well, spring is just around the corner, and when warm weather, this is just like the flu. And when warm weather comes, everything will get better. Unfortunately, warm weather may help, but that is not going to be entirely the case. There seems to be a different pattern of spread and infection than there is in true influenza, although this disease acts like that in some ways. For example, Singapore is near the equator, and although they have a hot, humid environment much like ours, they've had a lot of coronavirus, and it didn't seem to work there. One of the great paradoxes is if we do all the very painful and necessary things to care for our neighbor, people will say, look, that wasn't a big deal. We did all that stuff unnecessarily. But that's okay, and it's a price we're willing to pay.
Based on what Scott just shared with us here, that's very powerful information. You did a wonderful job. I can understand this now. But taking this and now applying that to what we've already talked about, loving our neighbor, I think it's incumbent upon us to take this into consideration. I need to think about, older people that are maybe have a compromised immune system, or even younger people that have chronic diseases. And I may think, hey, I'm young, this disease is not going to affect me that much. I've heard people say this on social media. It's almost like a cavalier attitude. Well, this is not going to affect me. It's not going to make me as sick, so I'm going to keep going out and doing the things I need to do. The problem with that is many times, from the research we've heard and what people are telling us, a younger person could carry this disease and not even know it for a few days, manifest symptoms that may almost be like a common cold, and they bring this sickness to an older person or a person with a compromised immune system, and we make them very sick. And that's really not being neighborly. That's not showing the love of Jesus Christ to that person. So this is strange for us to think about, that in some ways loving my neighbor means I'm going to isolate myself from my neighbor for a period of time, for a season of life, for their betterment, for what's best for them. And I think as Westgate, we need to be challenged as a congregation to step up at this time and practice this radical hospitality and love for our neighbor.
And Chris, I think another point in that cavalier attitude that I've heard some people say is that, I'm a young person, and there's other people who are perhaps it's their time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't reflect, I think, a Christian worldview and our Christian attitude about the sanctity of life. We've been very good about making sure that we understand that life is important in all its stages, very early, before birth. That's why we believe abortion is wrong. But also at the end of life, we need to have the same respect for life because it's created by God. People are made in God's image. And therefore, Christians act differently towards the old and the disabled and those with diseases. And we've always been, throughout history, people of compassion. And we've stuck out from the rest of the world because of the way we've acted towards people like that.
Amen. And I think one question that comes our way right now, and I had these thoughts too as we were talking about what we were going to do as a church. And I just want to talk for a minute practically, what does this mean? I mean, we've talked about this. We've talked about loving God, loving our neighbor. We've looked at these stats. What does this mean practically going forward for Westgate for the next few weeks, when the rubber hits the road? What's going to happen for us? And so as this comes out and we start formulating this plan, the first thought I had, is this sinful to even talk about maybe not assembling as a church on Sunday? Am I forsaking the assembly, as Hebrews 10:25 teaches? That's a command. I need to be with God's people, and I totally get that. And so I struggle with that idea. Okay, what if we don't assemble as a church on Sundays as a massive group coming together, all 400 of us on a Sunday? Is that somehow dishonoring God? Am I showing weakness there? And I went back to the wisdom of ages past. 100 years ago, they went through this same thing. It's almost uncanny with the Spanish influenza. And there was an article from the Gospel Advocate from October 24th, 1918. And there's a preacher by the name of J.C. Pkwy. And he takes up this very question. It's like he's speaking today to us. And he says, when you're sick, you and your family are sick, or you're sick personally, you don't go to the assembly because, number one, you don't want to affect those brothers and sisters in Christ. And also, you need to get well. And he said, what's the difference in saying as a massive group for a short period of time, we're just going to stay away from each other just so we don't hurt one another, we don't infect one another? And I thought that was a really good argument. The other argument Pkwy brought up, and this is one I thought about too, is government entities and CDC or whoever comes out and says, okay, you guys don't need to assemble. If it's 500 or larger, which is one number I'd heard, you don't need to assemble together. Are we somehow cowing down to the government? And they're almost likening that to maybe communism, where a communist government would come in and say, okay, you guys don't need to assemble in the name of Jesus. And Pkwy points out this is much different. This is where the government is actually coming in and saying, for the good of the citizenry, for people's health, we're asking you not to assemble in large numbers. They're not saying don't worship. They're not saying don't assemble in small, maybe family groups. They're just saying for a period of time, for a season of life, till this thing levels out, don't assemble as a large group. So I thought Pkwy's article was really informative.
And it'd be really ironic if the government was more concerned about the welfare of the people than the church was. That would shame us.
That's so true. And you mentioned earlier the church has always stepped up. Throughout ages, we've stepped up as God's people to the plate in very difficult situations. And I think this is one of those times we get to step up as God's people and be a blessing. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. There's going to be opportunities come our way to be a blessing to this community as people lose, income, as people are struggling maybe with sickness, and they don't need to get out of the house, and we can deliver groceries and things. There are going to be opportunities like that for our church family. Let me talk practically just for a minute. What's going to change immediately at Westgate? And so this is really important what I'm going to share with you at this time, because it's going to directly affect our church family. Starting this Sunday, we will suspend worship services. We're not going to come together as a large assembly starting this Sunday, March 15th. And we're going to suspend services until Easter Sunday, April 12th. So we will not come together as an assembled body here at this church building until April the 12th. Now, I think that's powerful. What I'm praying is this thing will pass by. Maybe we'll look at, Scott said, the great paradox. Hey, this wasn't what we thought it was going to be. And on Easter Sunday, we'll just come have the biggest celebration ever at Westgate about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But in the short term, we're just asking to please understand why we're doing this. We're doing this because we love our neighbor, and we love you. And we don't want to make anyone in this church sick or critically ill with this very dangerous disease. This is really serious business. And so in the coming weeks, here's how we're going to do some things. We're going to provide our sermons online where you can watch the sermon. I'm going to continue to preach through the Gospel of John, and I hope you're being blessed by those lessons. We're going to have the sermon. I'm going to provide a sermon guide with questions for you where you can answer those questions. We're going to provide communion cups for people, individual communion cups, where you can celebrate communion with a family. And let me just give you an example of how this might work with my own family. This may make a lot more sense. Tomorrow, we'll wake up in the morning, the Jones family, and we're going to watch the sermon. That'll be weird. I'll be sitting there with them watching my sermon. We're going to watch the sermon together on the Good Shepherd. Then we're going to go over the discussion guide that I'll be sending out to all the members. So we'll discuss that as a family, from little 9-year-old Anna Grace all the way up to 20-year-old Carlin. We'll discuss that sermon guide. Then we're going to take communion together, the Lord's Supper, as a family. And we're going to pray. We're going to pray and thank God for all the good things, but also pray for people in this disease, that it won't be as bad as we think it's going to be. And we're going to do that for the next 4 Sundays as a family. We're going to have access to the sermon. We're going to have access to a sermon guide. We're going to take communion together, and we're going to pray for 4 weeks. Now, how are you going to get this information? Well, the sermon, we have a YouTube channel that we'll be pushing out. We have Facebook. It'll be off the website too. All kinds of ways we're going to push the sermon out to you so you can watch that with your family. We'll also have the sermon guide on the webpage, on social media. We can send that through email also. We're going to be really pushing our digital resources a lot in the coming weeks, so that'll all come out to you. Communion's a little bit different. If you need the elements for communion, we have the individual cups and wafers, and we're going to have those outside the office door in a container where you can come by anytime you want to, today, tomorrow, during the week. That's always going to be out there for you to come and get the communion resources you need. So what we're saying, we're not saying don't worship. We're just saying worship in small groups like your family. We may have people that are by themselves and you don't have family members to worship with. We would encourage you to find a family to worship with from this church. Call the office. We'll be around today. We'll be available. I'm available. You can call me and I can find someone for you to worship with, that you could take communion with and watch the sermon with. We want you to continue to grow in your walk with Jesus Christ. Also for children, if you're part of the children's ministry, Allison will be putting the lessons out on the Facebook page for the children's ministry. So if you're not part of that Facebook page, I say you need to go and request to be a member today. So we're going to push our lessons out through the Facebook page for the children's ministry. She will have the crafts and individual baggies out with the communion cups out in front of the office. So if you want to do the craft with your kid that they would normally do in children's church, you can come by the church and pick that up. They'll be waiting outside the office for you. And she'll have some video teaching she's going to put out there too for you. So we're wanting business to continue as much as usual as possible, where we're studying the same things, we're growing with the Lord. We're just spending some more time with our families. And look at this as maybe a blessing where you, the hustle and bustle of life, you can slow down for just a minute, spend more time with your family. Maybe you grow even in your faith a little bit more. Keep reading those Bible readings in our bulletin. Those readings are going to keep coming. The Illuminated Word podcast is still going to roll out. So many things are going to continue the same. We're just not going to meet together in large groups, and that includes Wednesday night too, just for a short period of time. And I'm praying that Sunday, April 12th, we will have a celebration, and we'll celebrate the Lord's resurrection, and things will roll back to normal. Right. And maybe we'll be even more thankful for our church family. And I just want to say, from the staff and the elders, we love you guys. And this is why we're doing this. And we hope you understand.